my name is Lee Saxby, running coach and biomechanics researcher with a particular interest in the shape and structure of the human foot. And this is my friend and fellow foot obsessive, Sebastian Baer.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Baer. I'm the inventor of the functional footwear design concept, and just the same way as Lee is obsessed with the natural function of the foot, I particularly have my field of interest in shoe lasts and how the natural foot functions inside a shoe. So I have spent my last decades researching the function of footwear and how the foot moves naturally in functional footwear.
So what you'll learn from us is I'll be talking about foot function and Sebastian will be talking about functional footwear. Enjoy.
Have fun.
There is a silent epidemic in the modern world, which we call the shoe-shaped foot. The natural foot, that is to say the unshod foot, a foot that has never worn a shoe, is foot-shaped or fan-shaped, and the widest part of the foot is across the toes. In the modern foot that has been deformed by footwear, the toes are compressed together, the alignment of the metatarsals change, and the alignment of the rest of the bones of the foot change. And this is a problem because the foot needs to be strong and mobile to perform its basic functions.
Well, it makes complete sense what you're saying there, Lee, because I'm coming from a footwear background. Actually, I can see how over the years and decades, the shoe industry has always been using a last like this, which is symmetrical and pointed to the front. And that kind of symmetrical pointed shape puts the toes together like you were just explaining, exactly like that, which leads to a naturally dysfunctional foot.
And speaking of function, the basic functions of the human foot is to provide stability, shock absorption, and propulsion.
The human foot is multifunctional. It must provide a stable base of support for standing and movements in which the feet are static but the body is moving, such as squatting. In more dynamic movements that involve the foot leaving and returning back to the ground, such as jumping, walking, jogging and running, the foot must provide shock absorption and propulsion whilst also providing dynamic stability. During locomotion, the foot and ankle complex functions as a series of 3 anatomical rockers or pivot points for the forward progression of body weight. These rockers are known as the heel rocker, the ankle rocker and the forefoot rocker. The rockers of the foot and ankle create forward progression by utilising and redirecting the force of gravity. Gravity is obviously directed downwards towards the floor, but by using the rounded surfaces of the heel, ankle joint and metatarsal heads, some of this force can be redirected to create forward momentum. As forward progression to the 3 rockers is being created by gravity, the downwards pull of gravity must be controlled by the muscles and joints of the supporting leg, by providing structural and postural stability, shock absorption and propulsion. During high-speed, high-force movements, such as running, jumping and sprinting, the impact generated by using a heel rocker strategy for initial contact with the ground can be perceived as potentially harmful to the body by the brain, and a different foot-ankle rocker behaviour will emerge. Forefoot rocker, ankle rocker, forefoot rocker. The body's preference for landing on the heel during walking and jogging and its reluctance to land on the forefoot is due to the metabolic cost and risk of injury associated with landing on the forefoot. When landing on the forefoot, the leg must become biomechanically stiffer and use more muscle action to absorb the shock of landing, particularly in the lower leg. Also, the tensile and compressive stresses acting on the forefoot and midfoot increases due to the range of motion required and the rate that the foot must untwist or pronate to absorb the shock of landing. The Lamina Pedis. The human foot is comprised of 28 bones linked through 33 joints, fastened by 3 layers of ligaments and supported by over 100 intrinsic and extrinsic muscles. Attempting to understand and describe the movement of these structures during gait is both complex and confusing. A simple model that accurately describes the function of the foot during gait, which is relatively easy to visualize, is to imagine the entire foot below the ankle as a twisted, bony ligamentous plate, i.e. a lamina pedis. The lamina pedis, or twisted plate, describes the spatial arrangement of the bones in a functional foot. In a functional foot, the toes and metatarsal heads are parallel to the ground in the frontal plane, while the talus and calcaneus, the bones of the rear foot, lie on top of each other, perpendicular to the ground in the sagittal plane. Essentially, the rear foot position is twisted relative to the forefoot position. In this alignment, the foot is known to be in a rectus or neutral position, which represents the optimal alignment of the foot to provide stability and function as a shock absorber and propulsive lever. In a functional foot, the joints of the midfoot are mobile enough to allow the forefoot and rear foot to be perpendicular to each other. When acting as a shock absorber, the lamina pedis untwists. For this to happen, the forefoot must be stable, aligned with the ground, and the rear foot pronates. The untwisting of the foot places the bones of the foot in a loose pack position, and the foot becomes a compliant shock absorber. It is important that the midfoot is mobile enough to allow the rear foot to pronate whilst maintaining the metatarsal position firmly on the ground. When acting as a propulsive lever, the lamina pedis must twist beyond its neutral position, which requires the forefoot to be stable and level with the ground and the rear foot to supinate. The bones of the foot are then placed in a close pack position and the foot becomes a rigid lever. Again, it is important that the midfoot is mobile enough to allow the rear foot to supinate whilst maintaining the metatarsal position firmly on the ground. In the shoe-shaped foot, the lamina pedis, or twisted plate, becomes dysfunctional. This is because the shoe-shaped forefoot can no longer position all the metatarsal heads flat on the ground and can no longer act as a stable base for the rear foot to pronate or supinate. Also, the midfoot of a shoe-shaped foot is stiff and immobile and does not have the range of movement to allow the rear foot and forefoot to move independently of each other. When the shoe-shaped lamina pedis attempts to act as a shock absorber and untwist, the rigidity of the midfoot and the lack of stability of the forefoot causes the entire foot to pronate, which is commonly known as overpronation. When the shoe-shaped lamina pedis attempts to become a propulsive lever by twisting, the rigidity of the midfoot combined with the lack of stability of the forefoot causes the entire foot to supinate. This is commonly known as oversupination. In addition to providing an anchor or stable base for the rear foot, a functional forefoot with correctly aligned stable metatarsals provides a series of drums or pivots for the windlass mechanism of the plantar fascia, or plantar aponeurosis. When the foot is loaded during the gait cycle, the longitudinal arch flattens and tightens the plantar aponeurosis. The tension on the plantar aponeurosis passively flexes the toes onto the ground. This passive plantar flexion of the toes on the metatarsal phalanges joints by the plantar aponeurosis is called the reverse windlass mechanism. During the Forfeit Rocker phase of walking and running, when the heel lifts off the ground, the plantar aponeurosis is stretched across the metatarsal heads whilst the toes remain firmly pressed to the ground. This is known as the windlass mechanism, which is an important passive supporting mechanism for twisting the lamina pedis and maintaining the anchoring function of the toes during walking and running. Narrow symmetrical footwear not only disrupt the form and function of the forefoot and toes, but also the function of the windlass mechanism. The misalignment and instability of the first metatarsal and great toe and the fifth metatarsal little toe prevents these structures from acting as stable drums or pivots for the windlass mechanism. Therefore, the second, third and fourth metatarsals and their corresponding toes become the only stable structures to anchor the plantar fascia and act as drums for the windlass mechanism, which exposes these metatarsal heads and their soft tissues to excessive compressive and tensile stresses during walking and running. The destructive forces acting on the metatarsals and forefoot are amplified when the habitual use of elevated and narrow toe boxes are combined with an elevated heel of 10 mm or more. This elevated position of the heel shortens the functional range of the calf and Achilles and increases the tensile load on the plantar fascia, which in turn increases the stresses acting on the metatarsal heads. Functional footwear has been designed to restore and maintain the natural alignment of the metatarsals and toes, so that these structures can act as anchors for the plantar fascia and help preserve the windlass mechanism during walking and running. Once a significant hallux angle has been created, the lines of action of all the muscles that insert onto the great toe are dramatically changed. The forces these muscles generate are no longer supporting the windlass mechanism or the propulsive action of the great toe, but are now enhancing the deformity and creating instability.
One aspect that has been completely ignored in shoemaking in modern times is the function of the toes. In modern shoe design, you will notice that all shoes are designed symmetrically pointed towards the front. As you can see, as Lee is showing you, that squishes the toes together in the front and completely strips them of their natural function. On the other hand, in functional footwear design, we take the design of the original toe freedom last, which is asymmetrical, widest across the toes, and apply that in our shoemaking process. So in functional footwear, you'll have the toes spread out completely in the front, so that especially the big toe can anchor and stabilize the foot in the propulsive phase of walking and running, for example.
A particularly useful aspect of the human footprint and the foot map is the pressure distribution that we can observe on the heel and on the metatarsals. Because in a typically shoe-shaped rigid foot, we get a lot of pressure on the heel, calcaneus, and on the metatarsals, particularly the central three and the medial side of the first metatarsal and the beginning of the hallux. As we age, and this occurs in people over the age of 45, we start to lose the elasticity and density of the fat pads. So essentially we're losing in the natural cushioning at the bottom of the foot. And this becomes a problem when people want to transition to more barefoot or minimal shoes, because they've lost these fat pads, and combined with a compromised metatarsal structure, that can often be a very painful experience.
The plantar fat pads provide the natural cushioning under the heel and metatarsal heads of the foot. As we age, these plantar fat pads lose density and elasticity. Any reduction in plantar fat pad density or elasticity will be clearly revealed in the human footprint. A foot that has lost the structural integrity of its plantar fat pads due to age or malnutrition will display high pressures under the metatarsal heads and heel bone area.
So picking up on the point that Lee was just making about the metatarsal alignment and pressure distribution in the foot, it becomes particularly important to talk about cushioning in footwear. Under the age of 35, when you still have the right amount of natural fat pads in your foot, you get away with a thin and flexible sole because your fat pads are still functioning naturally and cushioning your foot. Now there's a sweet spot, which we call the Goldilocks Principle in midsole cushioning. It's not too thick, not too thin, it's just right. It provides enough protection for the foot while still enabling enough sensory feedback to avoid overstriding, pain and injury.
The human footprint can provide great insight into the form and function of the human foot and how it interacts with the ground. According to the functional foot map system, there are 4 basic functional foot types that can be related to the biomechanics of walking gait. These are 1. The functional foot, 2. The shoe-shaped foot, 3. The pronated shoe-shaped foot, and 4. The supinated shoe-shaped foot. The functional foot is foot-shaped, which means it is widest across the toes, and its footprint is identified by a clearly defined arch, even pressure distribution across the footprint, and a clear impression of each of the 5 toes. The leg alignment associated with the functional foot is known as rectus or neutral, as opposed to valgus, which is knock-kneed, or varus, which is bow-legged. A neutral or rectus leg alignment enables the body weight to be positioned over the centre of the foot. This means that the foot can then function as a stable base of support, in addition to providing a series of 3 biomechanical rockers during walking and running gait. The shoe-shaped foot, as the name implies, is shaped like a shoe. This means that the foot is widest across the ball of the foot or forefoot, and not across the toes. This is due to the toes being pushed together and elevated from the ground. The leg alignment associated with the shoe-shaped foot appears to be rectus or neutral in general appearance, but upon closer inspection there is normally evidence of the tibia being either internally or externally rotated on the femur. This is due to the foot being twisted beyond its neutral position and the bones being in a close packed position, which creates a rigid, immobile midfoot that no longer allows the rear foot and forefoot to move independently of each other. This causes the foot to move as one rigid segment during gait, which means the foot can no longer untwist during shock absorption, which is known as over-supination of the rear foot, and cannot twist during propulsion, which is known as over-pronation of the forefoot. This inability of the foot to untwist and twist appropriately must be compensated for by internal or external rotation of the tibia. During standing and slow walking, the footprint of the shoe-shaped foot usually displays a high arch and areas of high pressure in the central forefoot region over the 2nd, 3rd and 4th metatarsals. In faster, more dynamic walking, this pressure pattern often changes to high pressures on the heel and the 1st and 5th metatarsal heads, which become more pronounced as walking speed increases and the amount of pronation and supination increases. The pronated shoe-shaped foot is shoe-shaped in forefoot structure, but has a flat or low arch and usually a pronounced hallux valgus. The leg alignment associated with this foot type is valgus or collapsed inwards, with the feet in a toed out position. This alignment causes the body weight to travel medially along the inside of the foot. The pronated shoe-shaped foot remains untwisted throughout the entire gait cycle, and the footprint shows high pressures on the medial structures of the foot, such as the heel, the 1st metatarsal and the great toe, and the impression of the 4th and 5th toes may be absent. This foot type is associated with the classic overpronation pains and problems: hallux valgus, bunions, plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendonitis, medial tibial stress syndrome, patellofemoral pain, groin pain and back pain. The supinated shoe-shaped foot is unmistakably shoe-shaped with a high rigid arch, but it is distinguishable from the classic shoe-shaped foot due to the very obvious loading of the lateral structures of the foot. The leg alignment associated with this foot type is varus or bowed outwards with the feet in a toed-in position, which causes the body weight to travel along the outside of the foot. The supinated shoe-shaped foot remains twisted throughout the entire gait cycle, and the footprint displays high pressures on the base of the 5th metatarsal and high pressures on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th and 5th metatarsal heads. This foot type is associated with classic supination or underpronation pains and problems: hallux rigidus or limitus, hammer and claw toes, metatarsalgia, stress fractures of both the foot and tibia, osteoarthritis of the medial knee, iliotibial band syndrome, and pelvic and lower back pain. Because of my fascination with the human footprint and its diagnostic power, I created the functional foot map to accurately create a foot impression or footprint, and as you can see there's quite a lot of detail on that. And from this footprint I can analyse foot dysfunction and potential sources of pain and injury. As previously described, the human foot can be viewed as a twisted plate that must be anchored by the toes to allow the untwisting and untwisting action of the rear foot on the forefoot that transforms the foot from a compliant shock absorber to a rigid propulsive lever as required. The human footprint provides a unique insight into the structural integrity and the function of the twisted plate during gait. The most important stabilizer of the twisted plate is the great toe or hallux, and the ability of the great toe to provide stability is based on its alignment and position relative to the ground and the direction of bodyweight progression, which is usually forwards. A simple assessment of the alignment and functional capacity of the great toe is to draw a line from the medial aspect of the heel to the medial aspect of the forefoot, and then continue this line beyond the level of the toes. If this line makes contact with the impression of the great toe, this can be considered a functional alignment of the great toe. If the line does not make contact with the impression of the great toe, this can be considered a dysfunctional alignment, which can be further qualified by drawing a line from the medial aspect of the forefoot to the medial aspect of the great toe. The angle created is known as the Hallux Angle, which can be measured by a protractor or goniometer if required. The greater the Hallux Angle, the greater the instability of the twisted plate during locomotion. In barefoot or traditional sandal wearing populations, the long axis of the great toe is often abducted away from the midline of the foot and presents a positive hallux angle. In the 1800s and early 1900s, this abduction of the great toe was considered the ideal or most natural position of the great toe and was assessed using the Myers line. The average hallux angle in shod populations is approximately -8 degrees. And the average hallux angle in unshod sandal-wearing peoples is approximately +3 degrees. The restoration of a natural hallux angle to +3 degrees in an adult shoe-shaped foot is an unrealistic goal for most people. Striving to achieve a functional hallux angle of 0 degrees is a much more realistic goal. The twisted plate is at its most stable when the forefoot is perpendicular or 90 degrees to the rear foot. In this position, the midfoot leaves an impression in the middle of the footprint that resembles a concave arch. In a foot that remains in a twisted position throughout the gait cycle, the midfoot hardly makes contact with the ground and therefore leaves little or no impression in the middle of the footprint. In a foot that remains untwisted throughout the gait cycle, the midfoot is in constant contact with the ground and leaves a flat or even convex impression in the middle of the footprint. A simple method to analyse the impression left by the midfoot and to determine whether a foot is too twisted and high arched or too untwisted and low arched is to use a reference line known as the midline foot axis. The axis is a line drawn from the centre of the heel to the centre of the second toe. At the midpoint of the midline foot axis, which is measured using the length of the foot minus the toes, a perpendicular line is drawn, which is then further divided into 1 centimetre sections from the intersection of these two lines. An impression of the midfoot that touches the midline foot axis is considered ideal. If the impression is 1 centimetre either side of the midline foot axis or less, this can be considered functional. However, if the impression of the midfoot is beyond 1 centimetre in either direction, this indicates that the foot is either too twisted or too untwisted and will have problems in shock absorption or propulsion. Areas of high pressure in a footprint indicate excessive mechanical loads and compressive forces acting on the foot due to deformity or dysfunction of the lamina pedis or twisted plate. High pressures in the forefoot are invariably caused by the misalignment of the metatarsal heads and poor function of the toes, created by narrow symmetrical footwear and the formation of a shoe-shaped foot. Pressures in the forefoot and rear foot are further increased in a twisted high arch foot due to the reduced surface area in contact with the ground and the lack of mobility and shock absorption associated with this foot type. It is interesting to note that the established tripod model of foot function is based on the dysfunctional plantar pressures created by a rigid shoe-shaped foot. High pressures will also be observed in the aging foot and diabetic foot due to a reduction in the density and elasticity of the plantar fat pads on the bottom of the foot. It is important to bear in mind that up to 80% of the population present some form of malalignment, which means that it is not uncommon that both footprints and leg alignments to appear visually asymmetrical. The two most common malalignments are a supinated shoe-shaped foot on the left combined with a pronated shoe-shaped foot on the right, or conversely a supinated shoe-shaped foot on the right and a pronated shoe-shaped foot on the left.
Congratulations, you've completed the course. So hopefully now you know everything about human foot function and the importance of the human footprint.
All right, you've learned everything about how to differentiate between the natural asymmetrical toe freedom last and the symmetrical classical shoe last, and how that influences the natural function of the foot inside a shoe. So have fun applying that knowledge.
Talking about knowledge, there is also a running technique course available on myfoot.com where you'll learn the basics of video analysis and the common running related problems.
The majority of you watching this video will have come to the conclusion that you possess a pair of shoe-shaped feet. But please do not despair, as the foot is very plastic with incredible potential to restore both its form and function with regular corrective exercise and the habitual use of functional footwear. To learn more about the functional footwear design concept and to view the full range of footwear options available, please visit joenimble.com. If you would like to find a foot mat practitioner, buy a foot mat or a set of foot wedges to untwist your foot, please visit myfoot.com, where you can also purchase a personalised online assessment and corrective exercise program. If you would like more information regarding foot function and running, or would like to certify as a foot mat practitioner or running coach, please check out leesaxby.com.